We will begin with our first lecture on European expansion, interdependence via colonialism from the 15th through 17th centuries. It's important for everyone to realize that these lectures are not a duplication of what is in the textbook. Some things are covered in more detail than what you will read in the textbook, and in some cases the textbook goes further into detail or even covers things that we don't necessarily directly cover in the lecture. You as students in this course are responsible for all of the information. My suggestion is that you read the textbook chapter pages first before listening and taking notes on these lectures. Lecture terms. We're going to begin by talking about Portuguese exploration. Many people often think of Spain when they think of European expansion in the beginning of the age of exploration, but Portugal actually was first in this process. Under Prince Henry the Navigator, the Crown Prince of Portugal, starting in the early 1400s, there was this push from Portugal to try to find a direct route to India. For many generations, the spice trade coming from India had to travel across Arabia and then move into the Mediterranean before it would advance into Northern Europe. Every time these luxury items changed hands, the price would go up. So Prince Henry the Navigator was attempting to cut out the middlemen, especially those Italian middlemen in the Mediterranean who had dominated much of the trade between the Eastern world and the Western world for many generations. Prince Henry the Navigator heard of untapped wealth and of uncharted territories. He mostly wanted this direct route to these spices and luxury items. However, when he passed away in 1460, the Portuguese rulers will continue to push this process. What had happened was, after many years of the Portuguese explorers bumping along the western coast of Africa, returning home, drawing new maps for the next explorers to continue the process, they would finally round the Cape of Good Hope. In 1497, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and finally Portugal had a direct route to India. After Vasco da Gama, the trading post empire that the Portuguese will build will start to expand. Portugal developed a trading post empire instead of a colonizing empire or a colonial empire. They controlled trade by duties and taxes of those who wanted to do business in their ports. Not only that, but they also developed coaling stations along the western coast of Africa, where all who stopped had to pay fees to the Portuguese who ran those coaling stations. Eventually, the Portuguese will utilize some of these territories along the coast of Africa to exploit the differences in African tribal warfare, so they can purchase captured POWs from tribes and then ship them to the New World, which will bring about the reintroduction of the slave trade, which we will discuss more later. D'Albuquerque was another Portuguese explorer who will eventually establish the port city of Goa in India. And through that, Portuguese will control the spice trade for at least a couple of generations. After the late 1500s, early 1600s move along, we will see that both India and England will get involved in the spice trade business, and eventually they will eclipse the Portuguese domination of the spice trade in India. Once Portugal started to have some success and charting new territories surrounding the Cape of Good Hope, the Spanish also wanted to get in on the same game, since they were neighbors to the Portuguese. With the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, their kingdoms of Aragon and Castile were unified to create modern Spain. They will financially back the Genoese Columbus in his expedition in trying to keep up with their Portuguese neighbors. They will instead launch an expedition to push westward through the Atlantic Ocean to find their own direct trade route to India. They did not know how large the globe was, nor did they understand that there was this huge landmass known as the Americas. They felt that they could push all the way around the globe and reach Asia. However, we will discover that there is a whole new territory ripe for the picking. Columbus in 1492 set off on his voyage, thinking he could find this western route to the Indies. He will eventually land in San Salvador, and he will eventually refer to this area as the West Indies, thinking that he had reached the Indies themselves. He landed here, he thought he was in Asia, therefore the natives were referred to by Columbus and later Spanish explorers as Indians. Later voyages of Columbus's crew will discover that a whole new world was there for the taking. This will encourage other Spanish explorers to follow in his footsteps. In 1513, the Spanish explorer Balboa, just 21 years after Columbus' initial voyage, he will set sail west so far that he will eventually go through the straits, and he will determine that there was another ocean out there that no one in the West had prior knowledge of. The Pacific is what he will name it. He felt that the Pacific Ocean seemed so much more tranquil than the Atlantic Ocean, and that's why he named it the Pacific. It's actually an ironic name because the Pacific is far more treacherous, as later explorers will discover. One of these explorers was the Spanish explorer Magellan. Magellan, in another several years, will take a crew and will push eventually all the way around the globe. Although Magellan himself will die in the Philippines, he is given credit for the circumnavigation of the globe in 1519. His crew will return home to Spain. There will, of course, be exploration of the Pacific that will follow these journeys, and other nations will also get involved. Russia, coming across the Bering Strait into what will eventually be Alaska. England, of course, sponsoring the journey of James Cook that will eventually discover Hawaii, and others. After the Spanish determined that Columbus had not sailed to Asia, that he had in fact found the New World, although he's not really the first to found the New World, as we know, natives had lived there already. They will establish some settlements after Columbus's discovery. These Spanish Caribbean settlements will eventually become part of the Spanish colonial empire. The Spanish will develop a colonial empire instead of just a trading post empire like Portugal had done. They will establish settlements where they will exploit and take advantage not only of the products that the land can yield, not only of the wealth that the land can yield, but they will also exploit the native populations to their advantage. The Taino were the native peoples that the Spanish would exploit for labor in the Caribbean settlements. First, it started off with mining precious metals like gold and silver. The Spanish were after this specie so they could send it back home, that they could use then to buy other European products. The encomienda system was what was established by Spain, through which Spanish settlers could force labor out of the Taino. These were the ruling structures that were put in place by the Spanish. Within a generation, the mistreatment of the Taino by the encomiendas, as well as the European diseases that were brought by the Spanish, this would result in a great decline in the Taino population. These European diseases that were brought over would cause many to die in epidemics as well. Smallpox in particular would be extremely devastating to the native Taino population. Once the Taino started to die off in great numbers, the Spanish were faced with a dilemma. Who will work in the mines, and eventually who will start to farm the cash crops that they will plant? This is when we see the beginning of the African slaves being imported to fill that labor vacuum. The Portuguese, who had established these territories along the western coast of Africa for coaling stations, will eventually convert some of those areas to trade centers. They will exploit the native population's rivalries and eventually bring many African slaves over to the New World that will be sold to the Spanish. We also need to acknowledge that there was a great deal of piracy going on by other nations after the Spanish started to bring so much wealth into their nation. The English and the Dutch will sponsor raiding parties on Spanish holdings in the Caribbean. Now, these were not officially sponsored by the governments of England and the Netherlands, but those governments turned a blind eye to what was going on. They were not really trying to stop it. Both England and the Netherlands wanted to challenge Spanish dominance in both the Old and New Worlds by the time we move into the 1500s. And of course, we have many awesome pirate tales that come out of these episodes. Some were based on truth, others were complete fiction. Now, I mentioned before that eventually these Spanish Caribbean settlements will be transformed from primarily mining settlements to producing what will be known as cash crops. The Spanish will abandon the mining in the Caribbean when they discover a more profitable enterprise in cultivating these cash crops. Now, cash crops were usually widely popular commodities in Europe that could not be grown there. Eventually, sugar and tobacco became the primary cash crops that could be cultivated in the Spanish Caribbean settlements. Sugar was used for many things, but especially it was used for rum. Tobacco, this was something that the Spanish learned from the natives. They saw the natives smoking these leaves that they had dried, and they thought that it promoted, quote, good health, because it made you feel good. It gave you a little bit of a buzz. Eventually, these tobacco leaves would be marketed to Europe as a health product. Once Europeans were addicted, because it is a very addictive drug, the rest is history. You get people hooked on it, you produce a demand for your product, and you automatically have a big business. These cash crops that we discussed in the last slide ultimately become the basis for what will become known as the Columbian Exchange between the Spanish Columbian settlements in the New World and, of course, importing these products into Spain that they can then sell to other people in the Old World, if you will, or in Europe. The Columbian Exchange, if you look at this slide, you can see many different products that went between the Old and the New World. The Old World has some things that they would bring to the New World and sell to the native populations, as well as, of course, provide for their settlers that are there. Not just products, but also plants and animals would be exchanged between the Old World and the New World as part of this process. You can see a number of different products that I have listed here. As we said, some of these products will benefit the Old World, as well as some of the products from the Old World will benefit the New World. However, we will need to note that one of the big things that is exchanged between the Old and New World with the Columbian Exchange is not just the products, it's the diseases. The Old World had a great number of diseases that would be devastating to the New World population, because these New World natives did not have any immune systems built up for these European diseases. Smallpox will be extremely devastating to native populations, as you can see by the picture I have here of a smallpox victim. There would be other Old World diseases that would also be brought that could be devastating: cholera, tuberculosis, scarlet fever. But the New World also gave certain maladies to the Old World as well. Yellow fever, because of the boggy areas, the very humid areas with mosquitoes, but also syphilis. When the Europeans come over and start to exploit the native populations, oftentimes raping and pillaging is part of that process. Syphilis will eventually be introduced to Europe by these explorers, these sailors that come home to Europe that had forced themselves in many cases on the native populations, on the women of the native populations. So karma's kind of a bitch if you think about it that way. After a few generations of Spain pretty much having complete domination over Central and South America, they will continue to explore those areas. The English and the Dutch will start to officially sponsor some voyages of their own sailors to the New World, rather than just the pirates. The English and the Dutch utilize a different kind of system to fund these explorations. They were not primarily funded by the monarchy, as we saw with Spain and as well with Portugal. The English and the Dutch instead will utilize joint stock companies to fund the explorations. The joint stock companies basically were a way that businessmen could pool their resources together to fund an expedition across the Atlantic to the New World. Whatever profits came back to the home territory from the New World expedition would be divided up among those investors according to the percentage that they invested to fund the journey. The English East India Company was founded in 1600, and this company will remain in place for many generations and dominate a great deal of trade as well as exploration coming from the British. Colonies would eventually be established in North America. The Spanish really did not spend a great deal of time in North America beyond what will be Florida and Texas and California. The further northern territories were not really touched by the Spanish, so they were left open for the British to take advantage of. The British, of course, will also push into Asia and Africa, and we will talk about some of those in later lectures as well. The Dutch also had a joint stock company known as the United East India Company. And eventually they will come to eclipse the Portuguese domination of the spice trade in not just India, but also in Indonesia. The Dutch will become very wealthy as a result of this. So now let's discuss some of the results of this European expansion. One of the major results that happens in terms of what's going on in Europe is we have the beginning of a price revolution in Europe. A price revolution ultimately refers to the impact this will have on the economies of the European nations. A lot of this price revolution was caused by the massive influx of gold and silver, also known as specie, coming into Europe via Spain and their control of their colonial empire. As they bring this gold and silver into Europe and flood those economies in Europe with this gold and silver, it will cause massive inflation throughout Europe, devaluing the currencies all over Europe and ultimately causing a massive rise in prices on almost all goods. Now, this is part of capitalism. The merchant class will do their best to take advantage of the situation, and eventually we will see that capitalism will continue on the rise as a result of some of this. The joint stock companies that we referred to earlier are also evidence of capitalism on the rise. More and more independent businessmen are investing in these ventures across the ocean to try to maximize the wealth that they can get out of this process. But of course, we need to also make recognition of this ecological revolution. The Columbian Exchange, which brings products as well as other things into Europe from the New World, as well as things from Europe to the New World through these colonial settlements that Spain had established, has positives and negatives, as we discussed in a previous slide. You can return back to that slide to look at the different products and things that came from one place to the other. There are good and bad things. We talked about the diseases that were exchanged, and the smallpox in particular will wipe out huge portions of the native populations in Central and South America, upwards of 90%. Some historians have argued even more. When the native population declines so greatly, the Europeans need to find a new way to harvest those cash crops and dig in those silver and gold mines. And this is when we see the African slave trade become part of what will be known as the triangular trade, an offshoot of the earlier Columbian Exchange. The triangular trade, many of you have probably studied in previous courses before. But ultimately, this particular illustration shows you the basics of it. Raw materials from the cash crops as well as from the mines comes from the New World and moves into Europe. Europe will then use that to help those raw materials to produce more and more manufactured goods. Many of those manufactured goods, in particular guns, will then be exported to the coast of Africa. They would be used in intertribal warfare between African natives as well as with the Europeans against the African natives. Eventually, prisoners of war between different African tribes can be sold to Portuguese slave traders, and later it would be others as well. And then those slaves would be brought back over to the New World to work in the mines or in the fields of the cash crops. By the 18th century, the slave trade was part of this triangular trade. Manufactured goods from Europe go to Africa, And when these slaves are sent to the New World, they are exchanged for raw materials. One of the major raw materials that come to Europe, of course, is sugar. Tobacco as well. But sugar and molasses were a major cash crop. And most of the time that sugar would come across the ocean and be used to be distilled into rum. The African slave trade was a brutal business, to say the least. Slaves were often captured in raids by African chieftains who would literally steal people from rival tribes, and they would steal them away from their families, kidnapping them from villages, and eventually a lot of this tribal warfare was conducted solely for the purpose of capturing slaves so they could sell them to the Europeans. Once the Europeans got control of the slave population, they would be sent across the ocean in what was referred to as the Middle Passage, because it was the middle part of this triangular trade in the middle territory between Africa and the Americas. The Middle Passage was very difficult. As I said before, when slaves were captured, they were oftentimes forced to march to the western coast of Africa to await transport. Once they arrived there, they were packed onto ships, and they would suffer horrible conditions for 4 to 6 weeks at a time as they traveled across the ocean. Oddly enough, usually they would only have room to sit upright or about 20 inches of space, each lying down on these shelves. There was a very high mortality rate as a result of this. Early on, only about 50% of the slaves that were packed onto the ships made it to the New World. Overall, the Atlantic slave trade, there were approximately 25% of the Africans that were shipped over that would die in transit. So it eventually got better, from 50% to 25% mortality rate, but that's still a great number of people. The increase of the slave trade would move from the 16th through the 18th century. Most of those slaves came from the western and southern parts of Africa, the sub-Saharan African territories. In the 16th century, approximately 2,000 slaves per year were brought over. In the 17th century, about 20,000 slaves per year were brought over. But by the 18th century, about 55,000 slaves per year will be brought over. This shows you that slavery becomes a big business as well.